Welcome back to this tutorial series on how to crochet a hexagon blanket. In this video tutorial I'm going to be covering how to sew your hexagons and half hexagons together into a blanket. If you're looking for the rest of the tutorials on how to make this blanket, I've organised them into a playlist that I'll link at the end of this video and down in the description. Let's get started sewing our hexagons together. So it doesn't matter too much where you start when you join your hexagons together, but I like to join mine together in rows, sort of row by row as we go down. So I've just taken 2 hexagons from the top left side of the first row of my blanket to join together. So this very first hexagon, we're not actually going to be using that very long yarn tail we left, so you can go ahead and weave that in first if you prefer. And then for the second hexagon, I have threaded that long yarn tail onto a large blunt tapestry needle. And the stitch we're going to be using to sew our hexagons together is called whip stitch. Specifically, we're going to be doing whip stitch through the back loop so that we get a nice join between our hexagons with defined edges for those hexagons. When I'm sewing or joining things together, I don't like working with my edge vertical like this. I actually prefer horizontal like this. So I've got the hexagon that I'm joining to at the top, and then the one that I've got my needle attached to at the bottom, and we're just going to be sewing along one side for this first row of hexagons. So for the first stitch, take that top hexagon and put your yarn needle through the back loop only of the second chain of this chain 2 corner here. So my needle is going in there and pull that yarn tail through. You don't want to tug really tight here because you can then distort your invisible join here. So just snug it up just so those 2 hexagons are now sort of next to each other. So now take your yarn needle and put it through the back loop only of the second chain of this corner, chain 2 here. So I'm going in here. Then move along to the next stitch along the 2 sides that we're joining on the grey hexagon and go through the back loop only. So on the orange hexagon I've gone from front to back, and on the grey hexagon I've gone from back to front. Then push your needle through and pull it. Again, don't pull really tight, but just give it a nice firm tug just to snug it all up together here. And then we're going to repeat this all the way along until we get to the corner space. I'll stay with you for a few more stitches. So I'm taking my needle and I'm moving over to the next stitch, and I'm scooping up the back loop only from front to back of that orange hexagon, and then coming from back to front on the grey hexagon there. So those are the loops I'm going through. I'm going to pull that through. So there, it's all snugged up, so you can see here are our stitches. By using the yarn tail we kind of hide our stitches because it sort of blends into either of the hexagons. So the next stitch we're going through the back loop only of the next stitch of the orange, and then the back loop only of the grey. So if you're not working at a desk or something like I am at a table on a surface, you may find it easier to actually hold your hexagons wrong sides together like this. Then you can stitch like this. You can pick up the back loop here and then the back loop of the grey hexagon there, just like that. So that's exactly the same stitch as we've been doing, but it might be a little bit easier for you to work if you're not working at a flat surface. So again, I'm going through the back loop only of the orange and then the back loop only of the grey. We'll do one more stitch together. So we're going through the back loop only of the orange and the back loop only of the grey. So now continue working along until you get to the corner spaces of these 2. So you're only joining one side of the hexagon, and I'll meet you at this corner space here. So I've made it to the corner space, and this stitch on the orange hexagon I'm going through the back loop only of that last double crochet, that side of the hexagon, Then I'm coming up through the first chain of that chain 2 corner space on the grey hexagon. So that signals to me, once we're going through the chain, that that was our last joining stitch. Then we take one more kind of half stitch. We just go through the back loop only of the first chain of the orange hexagon corner. So I'm going through there. And I'm going to pull that through and make sure my stitches are all snugged up tight here for this join. Then at the back, you can, if you want to, tie a knot here or pull a loop through a loop just to secure that final stitch. So I like to do this on this join just because it brings a bit more stability without adding too much bulk. So that final stitch there that we did is there, so I'm just going to sort of go underneath that loop, and that kind of ties it in a bit of a knot. It kind of locks it all into place there. And then I can work my yarn down that stitch and weave my tail back and forth in down here. So I'm then going to bring in the next hexagon and the next hexagon, and so continue doing that for one long strip of hexagons for your first row, and then come back to this tutorial and I'll show you how we join the second row by joining more than one side, because after we've done the first row, all of the rest of your hexagons you will either be sewing 2 or 3 sides per hexagon. So yeah, make that strip and come back to this tutorial. So I finished crocheting my very short strip of hexagons. Yours will be a lot longer than this, and I've just laid out my second row of hexagons to join. Like I said earlier, we're going to leave our half hexagons to the end. So on this row you're going to be joining the hexagons like this, so you're going to kind of have a wavy edge just for now until we join in those half hexagons once all of our full hexagons are joined together. So we're going to focus on sewing on this pink square next. So I'm just going to move this green square out of the way. So if you can see, for this pink square, it meets these 2 hexagons on 2 sides, so here and here. So that's where we're going to be sewing, and we're going to be sewing using the exact same method as we did when we just sewed on one side. So I'll just pop a yarn needle on my pink hexagon. So I've got my tail threaded onto my yarn needle, and we're going to start our join just as we did when we were joining on one side. So I'm going to take my needle from back to front on that second chain of the orange hexagon corner, come through, pull it up snug, and then I'm going to start doing those whip stitches through the back loop all the way along. So continue doing that just like we did here, and I'll meet you at this corner and I'll show you how we sort of navigate this corner here when we're joining on 2 sides. So I've just got my final stitch here for joining the pink and the orange one together. So I'm going in through that back loop of the pink and then the back loop of the first chain of that corner space of the orange hexagon. I'm just going to snug those stitches up. So now to join the pink and the grey together, we're just going to kind of continue on with our stitches. So my next stitch, I'm going to go through the back loop of the first chain of the chain 2 corner, then come up through the back loop of the second chain of the chain 2 corner of the grey, and then we've successfully sort of transitioned over to joining the pink and the grey hexagons together. So then we're just going to continue that join as normal. So we're going to go through the back loops of the pink and the grey hexagons, sewing all the way along here until you reach the end, and then fasten off and weave in your tail just as we did up here. And then when we're working a hexagon on 3 sides, let me just grab a hexagon. So when we're working the hexagon on 3 sides, we just do exactly that same transition as we did in that corner on 3 sides. And that's as simple as this join is. It's really a simple stitch just for joining these hexagons together. So I'll just finish sewing all of my hexagons together on this small sample that I'm making for this tutorial, and then come back to this tutorial and I'll show you how we sew on these half hexagons. We do it in the same manner, so the same method, but working these stitches into chain spaces can be a little tricky if you're not used to this stitch. So if you need it, do come back to this tutorial for joining on these half hexagons. So here are all of my hexagons sewn together. I do recommend weaving in your ends as you go before you join your half hexagons and crochet the border on, but as this is just a sample for this tutorial, I'm not going to do that because I'm planning on frogging this at the end. So yeah, do what I say and not as I do, and weave in your ends as you go. So the next step is to sew on those half hexagons, and I will show you what this looks like next because we're actually going to be sewing in the opposite direction as we did with the solid hexagons. So I'll zoom you in and we'll get started. So this is the half hexagon I'm going to sew into this space here, and when we were sewing our hexagons together we did it in this direction, but as you can see my yarn tail is over here on the other side of the half hexagon, so we're actually going to be sewing our half hexagons in the opposite direction that we sewed our hexagons together. It doesn't really matter which direction you go in too much, it just slightly changes the look of your stitches. So to start sewing your hexagon in, first go through the back loop of the second chain of this corner of this grey hexagon down here. That's our first stitch. And then we're going to sew across just as we did when we joined our hexagons until we reach this end. So we're going through the back loops only of each of the stitches along and then across those corners, and then come and meet me back down here and I'll show you how we sew this starting chain here to this corner. So yeah, work your way along here and I'll meet you down here. So I finished sewing all along these sides of the half hexagon. I'm just going to bring it up to the camera to show you. So I've just done a stitch through this stitch here and this stitch here, and as you can see we've got one stitch and a chain left to join on the full hexagon, but we've actually only got our starting chain left for the final two stitches. So we're going to go through this starting chain loop here twice. So my first stitch, I go through it and pick up that stitch there, just the back loop again. Then we're going to go back under that same starting chain, come up through there. And then that's what it looks like, and you can see there's a very small dip here, but when we crochet on our border that really does give a straight edge along this side of the blanket. So go ahead and weave in any ends you've got left, and then once the tutorial for the border is out next week I'll pop it up on your screen here.